Harvey, stop it right now. Your old way of thinking is slowing us down.
No, Kyle, it's your arrogance.
Harvey, your old school thinking is exactly why this project is falling behind. Kyle Rasmussen slammed his palm on the table before I could finish my first sentence. So that was the opening act. Not the data review I'd prepared, not the strategic update, just a public swipe at my competence before I had even clicked to slide one. Fine. If he wanted conflict, he had it, out loud. I kept my tone smooth. Inside. My patience was shrinking by the minute. Of course. Kyle, I replied, adjusting the remote. Let me simplify it so it fits your schedule. In my head. The line was less polite. Wonderful. A CEO who fears numbers more than he fears cardio. And if you think that was the worst part of the meeting, it wasn't even close, but only a few want to know the whole truth, not the comforting version. If you are one of them, subscribe and follow so you don't miss the truth behind. The screen lit up with the $800 million international infrastructure project I had spent 2 years architecting, as I was saying. I tried again. Phase 3 requires Kyle slice the air with his hand. We're modernizing everything, especially the team. We need fresh energy. Harvey, not people stuck in outdated methods. Fresh energy, right. Coming from a man who thought innovation meant adding blue lights to the conference room. I kept my expression neutral, even as irritation stacked inside my chest. A young engineer suddenly leaned forward, hesitant. But, none of this can proceed without Harvey's signature. Right, the international board requires. Kyle glared at him. Anyone can sign? Move on? The kid's face drained. The room followed. Everyone knew he was wrong, spectacularly wrong, but no one dared contradict him. I didn't bother arguing. I simply closed my folder, letting the silence speak for me. Because beneath my calm, a tight pressure, anger, disbelief, something colder settled in. If Kyle wanted to pretend expertise didn't matter, I wasn't going to stop him, but ignorance this bold, it always comes with a price. When Kyle Rasmussen cleared his throat with that theatrical little cough, I already knew he was about to make a spectacle. The meeting hadn't recovered from his earlier interruption, yet he pushed his chair back like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. Then, right in front of the entire project board, he announced, Harvey, your services are no longer required. For a man who preached humility, he certainly enjoyed grand exits. I watched the room tighten, shoulders stiff, eyes darting, a few mouths opening then snapping shut. No one dared question him. They just looked at me the way people look at someone standing a little too close to a lightning strike. I kept my expression steady, inside. Though, I felt that slow tightening, the familiar pressure behind the ribs that comes from knowing you're watching someone mistake arrogance for authority. Still, I let him finish his little performance. I stood, placed my badge on the table, and shut down my laptop with the kind of calm people usually need meditation apps for, if that's your decision. Kyle, I said, then I won't take up any more of your time. The irony, of course, was that it was my time that mattered most to the project. As I walked toward the door, the silence behind me wasn't heavy, it was stunned, and somewhere under the irritation, a thin thread of amusement tugged. Heartwarming. I thought, he just fired the one person he couldn't replace with the same dopamine hit as a TikTok challenge. The door had barely shut behind me when my phone buzzed. A subcontracting lead whispered, Harvey, why isn't the final verification step locked? We can't proceed without it. I stepped into the hallway, letting the cool air settle the heat simmering under my skin. I'm no longer authorized, I said. You'll need to ask Kyle. The silence on the other end told me everything, and somewhere in that quiet, I could almost picture Kyle's triumphant grin, the kind of grin only a man completely unaware of the disaster he'd just signed up for could manage. I kept walking, letting the laughter of another team meeting drift down the hallway. It sounded almost surreal, like background noise from someone else's workplace, not the one I'd spent years holding together. Still, beneath the frustration, a quiet, inconvenient patience settled in. Because while Kyle strutted back into the boardroom, imagining he'd done something bold, I already knew the part he didn't. The world outside that room wasn't nearly as impressed with theatrics as he was, and though I didn't smile, there was a flicker of something close to it, the kind that comes from watching a man congratulate himself for detonating his own parachute. I stepped outside, the sunlight sharp enough to make me squint, and finally exhaled. If you look closely, there's a hidden signal right in this frame. The drive home felt strangely weightless, as if the world hadn't quite decided whether to treat the day as a tragedy or a comedy, when I finally stepped inside my house. The quiet hit me first. Not the heavy kind that presses on your chest, just a soft, steady stillness that made the chaos of the morning feel impossibly far away. I set my keys down on the counter, inhaled once, and let the silence settle. For a moment I just stood there, listening to nothing in particular. It was almost unsettling how calm everything felt after being publicly dismissed like a malfunctioning printer. And yet, somewhere under the lingering sting, there was a thin ribbon of irony winding through my thoughts. I always imagined getting fired would be worse, but without Kyle within 2 meters of me, everything suddenly feels peaceful. I let out a slow breath, half a sigh, half a quiet laugh, then walked to my desk. My personal laptop hummed to life, its familiar glow washing over the room in a way the office fluorescents never could, out of habit. I checked my email, not the work account Kyle locked me out of within minutes, but the one tied to every certification I'd earned over the past 20 years. There, near the top, sat a message from the International Systems Certification Board. Reminder: any change in project leadership must be submitted at least 30 days in advance for continued validity. 30 days. Kyle hadn't given it 30 seconds. A faint bitterness tightened in my chest, not anger. Just the dull ache of knowing a preventable disaster was already unfolding. I leaned back in my chair, letting the implications sink in the entire project. All $800 million of it was now standing on a legal trapdoor he had yanked open himself. My phone buzzed. A message from Daniel, one of the longest-serving department heads. Harvey, they don't know what they just broke. I stared at the screen for a long second, then typed nothing back. Not out of spite, just a quiet acceptance. Whatever storm was forming at headquarters wasn't mine to redirect anymore. I closed the laptop gently, feeling the weight of the day settle into something quieter, almost resigned. The bitterness remained, but it was a soft edge, not a sharp one. Like watching an old building you once cared about being renovated by people who thought knocking down the foundation was a bold design choice. I didn't intervene, didn't correct anyone, didn't warn them. All I did was sit in the quiet, letting the calm stretch out around me, because sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the sound of gravity catching up. Most people skim this part, but you don't. Right. And here's the part most viewers don't know. By the next morning, the storm I'd quietly walked away from had already begun reshaping itself. From what I heard through the predictable chain of office whispers, the company had wasted no time pushing a young manager, Evan Harper, into my old role. Evan was the kind of eager talent CEOs loved: energetic, ambitious, and utterly unaware of the invisible tripwires woven through an $800 million project. I wasn't surprised. Kyle had always admired enthusiasm more than expertise. To him, replacing me with someone fresh probably felt like the corporate equivalent of repainting a cracked wall. From a distance, watching it all unfold was oddly relaxing. I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee, scrolling through a few messages from former colleagues. Apparently, Evan's first move as project lead had been to modernize the interface and streamline the back-end logic so it aligned with his personal workflow. Admirable goals, except the system he was tinkering with had been calibrated over 2 years to meet strict international tolerances, and even small modifications could send it spiraling. It reminded me of something I used to joke about in meetings. If you change one comma in this model, it'll start treating the Earth like it's flat, and apparently, someone finally decided to test that theory. By noon, I received a forwarded screenshot from a quiet engineer. I trusted a politely worded email from our primary partner. We have detected several inconsistencies in the submitted datasets. Could you please confirm whether the final numbers have been validated? Inconsistencies? That was their diplomatic way of saying, what on earth did you people just do? I couldn't help the small, amused breath that slipped out. Not a laugh, just an exhale shaped like one. The kind that comes when you're watching a child figure out gravity the hard way. Meanwhile, Kyle, ever confident, ever clueless, assured the partners that everything was under control. He even announced to the staff that minor system fluctuations were expected during leadership transitions. Leadership transitions. That's one way to describe tearing out the one person who understood how the machine worked. One message from a friend read, "Kyle said it's just a small bug. They'll fix it today." Right. A small bug, like discovering a missing screw on a plane mid-flight. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The project was now moving under its own momentum, and gravity was beginning to tug at the edges. As the day stretched on, I found myself feeling neither bitter nor triumphant, just detached. Bang Quan, really observing from afar as the team tried to patch holes they didn't know existed while calling them upgrades. The irony wasn't lost on me. When you violate every rule that keeps a structure stable, you don't get collapse all at once. You get a gentle tilt first, a warning, a shift in weight, and by the look of things, the tilt had already begun. Smart viewers will stay for this part, because it changes the whole story. The next morning opened with a kind of lightness I hadn't felt in years. No dashboards waiting, no crisis pings, no Kyle hovering behind my chair pretending to understand metrics he couldn't pronounce. Just air clean, unhurried, mine. And with that freedom came an opportunity I hadn't expected so soon, an interview with one of our industry's top competitors, Orion Systems. Walking into their glass-walled lobby felt strangely calming. No tension humming beneath the surface, no egos vibrating through the floorboards. The receptionist greeted me by name, no hesitation, no confusion, and for the first time since yesterday's spectacle, I felt something close to being seen, not as a tool, not as a placeholder, but as a professional with years of work etched into the industry's memory. The interview panel consisted of 3 department heads, all of whom shook my hand like they meant it. Their questions weren't tests, they were conversations, real ones. They asked about my architecture methods, my decision logic, the way I handled cross-border compliance, and for the first time in a long time. I wasn't explaining the basics to someone pretending they already knew them. I was speaking to peers. It was liberating, freeing in a way I hadn't realized I'd needed. Halfway through, one of them leaned back and said, "Harvey, everyone here knows your work. The 2-year calibration on the international infrastructure model, that was you. Wasn't it?" I nodded. They exchanged impressed glances. That small acknowledgement carried more weight than the last 5 performance reviews I'd received combined. By the time we wrapped, I felt a quiet sense of alignment settling into place, like my life had been running off balance for years and had finally clicked into the right groove. But then came the twist, gentle, curious, and unintentionally sharp. The hiring director folded his hands and asked, "By the way, that $800 million project over at your old company, they're still using your certification for the technical validations, right?" For a moment. I simply looked at him, letting the question hang. Not in malice, just in acknowledgement of the truth only a few people understood. Then I smiled. A small, calm curve of acceptance. Probably not for much longer. I said, "He didn't pry, and I didn't elaborate. I wasn't here to sabotage anyone. I wasn't here to plot revenge or push anything off a cliff. The situation was already in motion, and the laws governing it were far more effective than anything I could manipulate myself. Sometimes you don't need to tear anything down. Sometimes all you have to do is step aside." As I walked out of the building into the open air, that feeling freedom, real freedom, followed me. The wind was cool, the day was bright, and for the first time since the firing, I felt something close to relief. The storm behind me was gathering speed, but ahead of me, it finally felt like a beginning, by the time reality finally caught up to them. I was sitting in a quiet cafe on the east side of town, sipping a cup of coffee that tasted far better than any victory ever could. The morning sunlight slanted across the table, warm and unhurried. And for once, I felt exactly the same. No pressure, no deadlines, no CEO breathing behind my shoulder like a malfunctioning air purifier. Just calm. My phone buzzed with the kind of urgency that only comes from a company trying desperately to pretend it's not in trouble. A former colleague had forwarded me a chain of email screenshots, timestamps, panicked subject lines. Apparently, the certification authority had begun their routine verification on the $800 million project. Standard procedure, routine, predictable. And that's when the first crack surfaced. They had asked for confirmation from the original technical custodian, a formal way of saying, "We need the person responsible for building the system to verify its data, the company." in all its newfound confidence, submitted the name of Evan, my very enthusiastic replacement. The response from the international board arrived 13 minutes later. Short, brutal, surgical, not valid. Please provide the original custodian. I actually paused mid-sip. Not out of shock, just appreciation. Some institutions don't bother sugarcoating reality, and I respect that deeply. The next screenshot came from someone in compliance, Kyle Rasmussen, calling an emergency meeting. According to the notes, he tried to spin the issue as a minor administrative hiccup. Kyle always did have a talent for minimizing catastrophes he personally created. I kept scrolling. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, not with anticipation, but with the kind of calm amusement a person feels while watching the universe gently correct a bad decision. A legal advisor had apparently pulled Kyle aside and whispered the one line guaranteed to turn his face the color of printer paper. If he's no longer employed here, we have no legal right to request his assistance. I could imagine the silence that followed, the slow, creeping panic, the dawning horror of a man finally realizing the cost of his own theatrics. I leaned back in my chair, letting the cafe noise wash over me, distant conversations, clinking cups, the soft grind of the espresso machine. Everything around me felt balanced, steady, almost serene. Meanwhile, the project I had built was beginning to tilt under the weight of rules they hadn't bothered to learn. A few more messages popped up, each one sounding more frantic than the last. Questions about missing verifications, mismatched datasets, escalating concerns from foreign partners. And threaded through it all was Kyle's increasingly desperate insistence that everything was manageable. I didn't reply, didn't engage, didn't even smirk well. Not much. There was no revenge here, no triumph, just a quiet, undeniable sense of things falling exactly where they needed to fall. Reality had sent its invoice, and Kyle, finally, was opening it. The first sign that the collapse had begun arrived long before anyone was willing to acknowledge it. I was sitting in a quiet library corner with a book open in front of me, not actually reading, just letting the silence settle. Meanwhile, back at the office, Kyle Rasmussen was apparently storming through hallways, summoning people into what he dramatically titled an emergency strategic alignment session. It was the kind of name leaders use when they want panic to feel like vision. From the messages I received later, he opened the meeting exactly the way I expected, by blaming the new project team. He claimed their improper data handling was causing delays. He insisted the mismatched numbers, the corrupted models, the missing validations, all of it were symptoms of inexperience, not leadership mistakes. It was almost impressive how smoothly he shifted the spotlight away from himself while the floor was crumbling under his feet. But the truth has a way of sitting patiently until someone trips over it, and according to the forwarded notes, it didn't take long. The certification board had flagged the dataset again, stating that the financial simulations were inconsistent and the risk matrices didn't follow the previously approved structure. They requested a meeting with the original technical custodian. Using my full name, Harvey Cross, with an emphasis no one could pretend to misunderstand, Kyle, in typical style, tried to bluff his way through. He told the room I was still offering advisory oversight and remained available for remote consultation as needed. I imagined him standing there saying it, voice steady, hands folded, hoping confidence would disguise the desperation underneath. But partners with $800 million on the table don't accept vague reassurances. They requested a direct meeting live, in person, no substitutes. And that was when the silence reportedly hit the room like cold air from a broken vent. Then came the twist that ripped away whatever mask Kyle was trying to hold in place. A young engineer, probably nervous and unaware of how fragile the moment was, muttered, "But you fired Harvey last week." The entire conference room froze. No one spoke, no one breathed, even reading it secondhand. I could feel the weight of that moment, the kind of stillness that forms when truth steps quietly into the room and everyone realizes they've been pretending not to see it. From there, the suspicion began spreading across the partner side. If Kyle had hidden something as critical as replacing the project lead, what else was he hiding? Were the numbers reliable? Were the assurances honest? Was the company acting in good faith at all? I closed the library book, slid it back on the shelf, and stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. Calm, detached, because the truth didn't need my help to land. It was landing all on its own. The final call came on a quiet Thursday morning. just as I was settling into a corner booth at my usual cafe. The steam from my cup rose lazily, completely unaware that somewhere across the city, $800 million of ambition was about to collapse. I opened my laptop out of habit, but I wasn't expecting anything dramatic. After all, the truth had already started pulling at the company's seams. Then the messages began to stack, each one more frantic than the last. The partners had called for one final virtual meeting, a last chance, Kyle claimed, to rebuild confidence before signatures. I clicked open the forwarded invite, imagining the tension buzzing through their conference room like static. When the meeting started, the partners didn't waste a second. One of them, a composed man with a clipped accent, leaned forward and asked, "Where is Harvey Cross?" "We only sign with him." The moment was so direct, so unforgiving, that I almost felt the silence from kilometers away. Kyle tried to swallow his shock, but the microphones caught his stumbling. He muttered something about me assisting remotely. But the partners cut through the lie instantly. "We require him present. No exceptions." It wasn't a request. It was the sound of consequences arriving. Kyle froze, and for a long second no one spoke. Then, finally, he admitted the truth. "Harvey is no longer with us." The partners exchanged looks, not angry, but disappointed in the way adults are when a child breaks something expensive despite being warned. The lead partner nodded once, then delivered the sentence. "Then there will be no agreement." And just like that, 2 years of negotiations, planning, engineering, and optimism evaporated into nothing. They ended the call without ceremony, without apology, because truth, when it arrives, does not bother with politeness. A few minutes later, they sent a formal notice. The forward landed in my inbox, its wording as crisp as shattered glass. Personnel transition violated international compliance protocol. Cooperation terminated. No metaphors, no room for debate, just the official stamp of a disaster Kyle authored entirely by himself. I sat back in the cafe, letting the quiet settle around me again. No smile, no gloating. Just the steady, undeniable satisfaction that comes from watching cause and effect align perfectly. Kyle Rasmussen, somewhere in that glass building, was probably turning pale enough to match the walls. I closed my laptop and stepped outside, letting the cool air brush against my face as the door shut behind me. The world felt strangely steady, as if it had been waiting for this correction to fall into place. I wasn't angry, and I wasn't triumphant. I simply felt aligned with reality again. People walked past me on the sidewalk, unaware that a multi-billion-dollar corporation had just learned a painfully expensive lesson about honesty and competence. I moved down the street with an ease I hadn't felt in years, carrying nothing but the quiet certainty that the story had finally reached its rightful turning point, and for the first time in months, I felt free. The day after the deal collapsed, my phone lit up like it had been plugged directly into a power plant. Dozens of missed calls, all from the same number, Kyle Rasmussen. The man who couldn't spare 30 seconds to listen to a technical explanation was suddenly willing to spend entire hours chasing my voicemail. I let every single call ring out, not out of spite, out of principle. Some lessons only sink in when delivered by silence, by late afternoon. He tried again. The screen flashed with his name, jittering as if even the phone understood the desperation behind it. I finally answered, not because he earned it, but because I was curious how far he had fallen. "Harvey, we need to talk," he blurted. I kept my voice calm and clipped. "I'm busy." A pause stretched, long enough for me to hear his panic begin to condense. "Please, this is important." "Still busy," I repeated, then hung up, not slamming the door, just closing it quietly. Sometimes that lands harder. An hour later, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Kyle standing on my porch, drenched in sweat despite the mild weather. His suit, normally pristine, looked like it had been ironed with a garden hose. I leaned against the doorway. "I've never seen a business suit sweat that aggressively," I said. "New fabric." He swallowed hard. "Harvey, please, we need your help. The board is furious. The partners won't return our calls. The project is dead without you." His voice cracked in a way I'd never heard, thin, brittle, stripped of every ounce of the arrogance he used to sharpen his sentences, behind him. The sun cast a long shadow toward the street, like even the daylight wanted to keep a safe distance from his humiliation. He tried again. "Look, I'll triple your salary. Full autonomy. Choose your team. your hours, your budget. We'll issue a signing bonus that reflects your value. His throat stumbled over the last word, as if admitting it physically hurt. For a moment, I simply watched him, not cruelly, not triumphantly, just observing the quiet unraveling of a man who finally realized the weight of consequences. There was a pressure in the air around us, a heavy, silent gravity that didn't require raised voices to make its point. Everything had shifted. He knew it. I knew it. Anyone watching would know it instantly. I let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of answer. Then I spoke. Calm and even. I'll consider it. Kyle's expression flickered with desperate relief. But, I added, that's not a guarantee. His face fell again just slightly, but enough to show he understood the reversal completely. The man who once dismissed my expertise with a wave of his hand was now standing on my porch, waiting for permission to hope. I closed the door gently, leaving him alone with the quiet he had earned, and for the first time in this entire saga, the balance felt exactly right. When I finally walked back into the building, the air felt different, as if the walls themselves knew the balance of power had shifted. I went straight to the project room, opened the corrupted files, and began undoing the enthusiastic chaos Evan had sprinkled like confetti over 2 years of calibration. It took hours of quiet, focused reconstruction, restoring each matrix until the system finally behaved again, settling into the familiar rhythm I had built by hand. When the partners joined the verification call, their relief was immediate, and after reviewing the corrected model, they agreed to sign. Kyle hovered behind me, pretending confidence, but his forced smile trembled every time the partners addressed a question directly to me and ignored him completely. By the end of the meeting, the contract was sealed, and the room erupted with relieved applause. Though everyone secretly knew who had saved the project, Kyle attempted to step forward for a triumphant handshake, but the partners passed him entirely and stopped in front of me, offering genuine gratitude. They asked if I would remain available for future oversight, and I answered honestly that my role here would conclude as soon as the final documents were submitted. The quiet that followed traveled through the room like a wave, and even without turning around, I could sense Kyle's expression collapsing behind me when we left the conference area. He trailed after me, offering a strained smile as if pretending nothing had happened might rewrite reality. He thanked me too loudly, promised a renewed partnership, and rambled about future collaboration, but the tension in his voice betrayed how terrified he still was. I simply nodded, walked to his office, and placed my resignation letter on his desk, watching the hope drain from his face like water slipping through cracked stone. He stammered, offering more money, more authority, more promises, but the truth was already settled. My part in that building had ended the moment he fired me. I left the office quietly, passing employees who straightened instinctively as if sensing the shift, their eyes following me with a respect that hadn't been there before. Outside, the partners approached again, this time offering something entirely unexpected, a global project director role with compensation that tripled Kyle's desperate proposal. For a moment, I stood still, letting the scale of it settle, feeling justice fall into place with a quietness so complete it almost felt ceremonial. I accepted with a steady nod, knowing I wasn't stepping backward into anything but forward into something finally worthy of the work I carried. As I walked away, the afternoon light stretched across the pavement, and I realized that being fired had never been the ending Kyle imagined. It was the beginning I needed. In the end, I couldn't help smiling to myself, thinking how getting fired had somehow become the biggest promotion of my life. When everything finally settled, I realized the real victory wasn't the job offer or the salary, it was remembering my worth even when someone else tried to shrink it. Sometimes losing a place you've outgrown is the first step toward finding the one you deserve. And now I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Your comments, likes, and shares help this community grow. And if you're new here, subscribe, there's so much more ahead.